Disclaimer!
The following section discusses rape, sexual assault, murder, and the abuse of animals. This episode of the podcast may be experienced more shocking than others. Viewer discretion or listeners' discretion is advised. Hi guys, welcome to episode 4 of
PodCrime!
And today we're gonna talk about a serial killer called Ted Bundy. Yeah, and now I'm gonna give the mic to my hostess Navaani.
Hello. Okay, let's start off with his early years. That's early years. Eleanor Louise Cowell, who went by Louise, was 22 years old and unmarried when she gave birth to her son Theodore Bundy. Louise was Ted's mother, and Ted was born on November 24th of 1946. Louise delivered Ted at a home for unwed mothers in Vermont, and later brought her new son to her parents' home in Philadelphia. Now Ted's father may have been a man named Lloyd Marshall, who was an Air Force veteran and a Penn State graduate, according to Anne Rule.
A co-worker of Ted's.
Yes. She was also an author of the book The Stranger Beside Me. Other sources had Ted's father named Jack Worthington, while some rumors had it that his father was also his grandfather.
That's some
Yeah.
Alabama stuff, man.
Okay. On Ted's birth certificate, there's a little section where you put who the father is. His father was listed as unknown. His biological father, identified honestly, may never be confirmed, but there are just a ton of different rumors as far as what it could be, and a lot of speculations as well. Now, Ted's mother, her name is Eleanor, like I had mentioned, was brought up by parents who were very religious, and having a baby at 22 years old without a husband, it was very frowned upon. To hide the fact that the father was unknown, Ted was raised by his grandparents as an adopted baby. And in his early years, he was led to believe that his mother was instead his sister. Ted and now his mother moved to Tacoma, Washington. In 1951, Ted's mother, Louise, she would marry a man named Johnny Bundy. And that's how Ted got his last name, Bundy. So Ted took his stepfather's last name, but it's said their relationship was not very good. Ted resented his stepfather for being uneducated and lower to working class. Louise and Johnny would go on to have several children together and just be a little happy family. Now it was said at a young age Ted was displaying odd fascinations with death, murder, morbid and gory topics. And it was set at the age of 3. Ted was obsessed with knives. He was very interested in knives. He would be playing with them, or he would like to collect them. And this was odd because, he was 3. Now, as a student, Ted was intelligent and did very well in school, but socially he had a hard time making friends. He struggled being social, but he was overall like a great student. And then when he became a teenager, puberty hit and his behavior started to go off the track. Ted, on his free time, would enjoy peeping in people's windows and would often steal things that he wanted.
That's a weird hobby.
Without showing any type of remorse or guilt. He would sneak off at nighttime, go look inside somebody's window, watch somebody undress. Now Ted would enroll into the University of Washington. And while there, he met and fell in love with a young lady from California. And Ted would say that he was attracted to her because she had everything that he always wanted and desired. She had class, influence, and money. Where he came from a family of lower class, no influence and no money. But the two did start dating. When she decided to end the relationship, he was devastated, and later it became apparent that many of his victims resembled her.
Ted will go on to graduate from the University of Washington with a degree in psychology in 1972. He also been accepted to a law school in Utah, but he would never earn his degree. Ted was a pretty smart guy. In 1969, Ted began a 6-year relationship with a woman named Elizabeth, who he met at a bar in Seattle. Elizabeth was a single mother of a young daughter, and she struggled with alcoholism, so she was addicted to alcohol. But Ted said that he took care of her, and she referred to Ted as a quote, warm and a loving man. By the mid 1970s, Ted had become more outwardly confident and active in social and political matters. Ted even got a letter of recommendation from the Republican governor of Washington after working on his campaign. Many would describe Ted as charismatic, kind, empathetic, and quite handsome. Having all these personality traits, but having all this mixed together, a bundle packed would actually end up helping him gain people's trust to eventually, later in the story, kill them. People loved him. It helped him get victims. I know that's why people are obsessed with him, because he was charismatic. He was handsome. At least, like, I don't think he's handsome. Ted would later on confess to 36 killings of young women across several states in the 1970s, and experts believe that the final tally of victims may be closer to 100 or more. The exact number of women Ted killed will never be known. His killings usually followed a gruesome pattern. He often raped his victims before beating them to death. Many women in the Seattle area and in a nearby Oregon went missing. Stories circulated about some of the victims last being seen in the company of a young, dark-haired man known as Ted Bundy. Ted would often lure his victims into his car by pretending to be injured and asking for their help. Ted will often go back to the bodies after he killed them, dispose of them. He would perform sexual acts, sadly, with the corpses. So he will perform necrophilia, as we have said in episode 1. He would continue to do this until the bodies were so decomposed or damaged by wild animals that it was no longer possible to have physical contact with them. At least 12 of Ted's victims were decapitated, so that means their head were cut off and kept in his apartment. Something to remember the killing from. But Ted kept these heads as trophies. We also discussed that before. It is said that Ted got a great deal of enjoyment reliving his crime simply by looking at it or touching the severed heads of his victims.
Okay, and these victims were for sure linked to Ted. On February 1st, 1974, a 21-year-old woman, she was
bludgeoned to death while she was sleeping, and her skull and her jawbone were discovered at Taylor's Mountain in Sonoma County, California.
And then on March 12th, 1974, a 19-year-old woman was also abducted, but she was walking to a concert. That's when Ted got her, snatched her up, murdered her, and then left her body at Taylor Mountain. She was never found, but Ted claims that he killed her for sure. They never found her. April 17th, 1974, a 18-year-old disappeared while attending a meeting at Central Washington State College. Her skull and her jawbone were found at Taylor Mountain. May 6th, 1974, a 22 years old, she goes missing from Oregon State University, and also her skull was found at Taylor Mountain. June 1, 1974, we had another 22 years old. She disappeared after leaving school. Her skull was also found at Taylor Mountain. Then June 11, 1974, an 18-year-old abducted from an alley behind her sorority house at the University of Washington. Her skeletal remains were found at...
This is such a weird... Issaquah?
And Ted had given a name and description of her.
We don't know. I don't know what Issaquah is. We don't know, but sorry, we tried.
July 14, 1974, a 23 years old. She was abducted from Lake Sammamish. It's a state park, but she was abducted in broad daylight, and her skeletal remains were recovered at
Issaquah, Washington. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
so weird name.
In July 1974, we have a 19 years old, and she was abducted for 4 hours after the loss of the previous victim. Her skeletal remains were recovered at Issaquah
Isekai.
as well.
Okay.
And then in the fall of 1974, Ted moved to Utah to attend law school. While there, uh, coincidentally, woman just began disappearing. He was doing work in Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. There were 9 victims. They were linked to Ted, and then in Florida there were 3. October 2nd, 1974, there was a 16-year-old who was ambushed, assaulted, and strangled in Holiday, Utah. And according to Ted, her body was buried near Capitol Reef National Park, which was 200 miles south of Salt Lake City. She had never been found. Then a 17-year-old, she vanished after leaving school in Bountiful, Utah. Only her knee cap was found, but it was never formally identified as belonging to this victim. It was in the location that Ted said it was, but they couldn't connect it to the victim that said it was. And then June 28, 1975, there was a 15-year-old, and she disappeared during a youth conference. And according to Ted, her body was buried near Prince, Utah, which was 75 miles southeast of Provo, but she has never been found. A lot of women that were linked to Ted were because Ted came forward, talked to detectives when he was in prison, and told them, who they were and where they were at. A lot of them just weren't found, and if they think they found them, it would just be bits and pieces of their remains, but not enough to actually link them or identify them. They were just trusting his word. In 1974, Elizabeth, the lady that Ted was dating at the time, now she started to suspect that Ted was just up to no good. Elizabeth snoops around and questions things like, where did this come from? Where do you have a meat cleaver in your desk? Ted, he used his charm to deflect. He just reassured her everything's fine, everything's good. She would end up going to police with her suspicion of Ted's involvement in the local murders, but they didn't believe her that he was indeed the killer, and the two of them would end up remaining together. Ted moved to Olympia the following year, and then in 1975, Elizabeth went to the police again, and this time with evidence that helped them to arrest Ted.
There's also a book about Ted. She ended up writing a book about it, about her experiences with Ted, and it was titled "The Phantom Prince in My Life with Ted Bundy." On August 16th, 1975, Ted failed to stop at a routine traffic stop and was caught and arrested by the Utah Highway Patrol officer in Salt Lake City. So this police officer pulls Ted over not knowing who was in the car, and he comes up to the car and he's looking at the passenger seats. He notices that the passenger seat is missing. So he's looking. He's asking Ted like, "Why is your seat missing? I know you didn't buy it like that, sir." The officer asked Ted to step out of his vehicle, and while the officer was searching Ted's car, that's when he came across what he called a murder kit. So the items that were found included a mask made from pantyhose, a ski mask, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, a crowbar, and a trash bag, as well as a number of tools. So like an ice pick, a hammer, just tools to build something. This officer didn't let him go like most officers in previous story may have done, because in a lot of cases officers just let these people go. So the officer was like, "What is this all?" And Ted is trying to explain why he has all these items. He's like, "These are just normal items that I had in my house. I bring them back to my apartment like it's not a big deal. It just happened to look that way." Ted was known to be very charming. He could talk his way out of just about anything. But the police officer remembered the description of the car and suspects from a kidnapping in November of the previous year, and the description and the car matched Ted exactly. The officer tells Ted that he's under arrest, and he arrests him. And after Ted was arrested, his apartment was searched, but they didn't find anything at that time. Ted was released and put on 24-hour surveillance. They can't hold him without any evidence. During this period, detectives would then interview his previous girlfriend, Elizabeth, and she was up in Seattle. She said that before Ted had moved to Utah, she came across very odd items in her apartment, but also at Ted's home. And they were like, she said she found a bag of white dry mixed plaster of Paris, crutches, surgical gloves, a sack of woman clothing, and a meat cleaver. So she's telling the detectives all of this. Now she would go on to say that that Ted was in debt. Like throughout his whole adult life, he has constantly been in debt. He never really had much money to his name, and he seemed to steal everything that he possessed. When Elizabeth confronted him about a new TV and a stereo that he had gotten, she asked him through like, "Where did you get this?" He warned her and said, "If you tell anyone, I will break your fucking neck." She also said that Ted would become very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair. It was very long, brown, and it was parted down the middle, just how Ted liked it. And all of his victims had longer hair. She told detectives, "He just got mad whenever I wanted to cut my hair, and then he was stealing things." At that time, Ted was driving a Volkswagen Beetle. When he got arrested, they went to his apartment and stuff, and they also needed to retrieve his Volkswagen Beetle, which Ted had sold to just a younger teenager. It was like an easy way to get rid of it. So they went and got his Volkswagen Beetle, and they were quite lucky actually, because the new owner hadn't done any deep cleaning, and they could put it under forensic testing. They found hairs in the vehicle that matched to three different women that were missing. One of them was still alive, and they were able to get the victim that was still alive. She escaped Ted's attempt to kidnap and murder her. Ted was then put in a lineup, and he was with other men, and they brought the victim who escaped and asked her to point him out. And she immediately pointed out at Ted. She said that Ted pretended to be an officer Roseland, and she was certain that Ted was the man that took her. For some gross reason, despite being charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assaults from the victim who got away, Ted was let out of jail once again on bail. While Ted was out, he was just kind of doing his own thing, but then he was brought back in February 1976 for the case of the woman who was escaped and was found guilty. He was sentenced to up to 15 years in prison on June 30, 1976. Now, this is just for one woman who escaped. This was not for any other murders or anything he had done. This is just for one lady. While he's in prison, at least he's there, and we can get him for all the other stuff he did. But Ted had remained in prison only up until October of 1976, because that's how he was able to escape prison and make a run for it. Ted was then found not long after hiding in some bushes out on prison grounds. Once he was caught, he was sent in solitary confinement, and he would be in there for several weeks. That same month that Ted was able to escape from prison, he was charged with the murder of a woman in Aspen, and he was transferred for the trial and chose to represent himself in court, so he didn't have a lawyer. He was excused from being handcuffed and shackled. At one point, Ted had visited the law library, which was located in the courthouse, so he can conduct research for his own case, and he was given permission. Ted noticed once he entered the library that someone had left the window open. He jumped out and he escaped from a second-story window. He would have ended up recaptured, but it wasn't until 8 days later. This wasn't the last time he would attempt to escape either. He kept escaping. And in December, Ted would escape from custody again. He climbed off a hole that he made in the ceiling. Now he was dedicated, but he dropped more than 30 pounds so he could fit in the small opening he had made in the ceiling. At night, Ted would practice climbing through it and navigating the crawl space. He was able to break free on December 30th, 1977. Ted piled up books on his bed and covered it with a blanket so it just looked like he was sleeping on his bed if someone walked by. Then he climbed through the ceiling hole. He then dropped down into the chief jailer's apartment. Ted drops into the apartment and steals his clothes and then just walks out of the front door like nothing happened. Ted was missing for 15 hours. This one of Ted's most brutal attacks occurred on January 15, 1978, while he was on the run after escaping jail. In the early hours of the morning, he made his way to Florida State University sorority house, and at around 2:45 a.m., he attacked a 21-year-old woman with a piece of firewood as she was sleeping in her bed. He then used a nylon stocking to strangle her, and then once she passed, he moved on and he went to another sleeping 20-year-old woman's room, and Teddy beat her until she was unconscious, then strangled her. With this victim, he tore off one of her nipples and then bit her buttocks and assaulted her sexually with a bottle. The bite mark left on this victim would actually later prove Ted's connection to these murders in the first place, because they left a mark and they were able to prove that these were Ted's teeth later on in court. Once he was done with this victim, he went into the bedroom next door, and Ted attacked the two women who were sleeping there. One of the women had her jaw broken and her shoulder was almost cut off, and the other woman received a concussion, a broken jaw, a broken finger, and some of her teeth were knocked out. All four women were attacked within 15 minutes. After fleeing from the sorority house, Ted broke into an apartment and attacked another woman student from the university. She suffered a dislocated shoulder, a broken jaw, skull was fractured in 5 places, and she was left permanently deaf. She survived. On February 9th, Ted kidnapped and murdered a 12-year-old girl and then fled. These crimes marked at the end of his murderous rampage because Ted was pulled over by a police officer on February 15th. He stole a vehicle and he was driving. He's trying to get anywhere. He's making a run for it. Police pulled him over, and when they ran the plates, they saw that the vehicle was marked as stolen. So when the police officer came back to Ted and informed him that he was under arrest, Ted flipped. He's like, I don't want to go back to jail. He kicks him and then runs off. The police officer fired 2 warning shots, then chased him. He caught up to Ted and he tackled him. They struggled, they fought, but the police officer was able to get Ted under arrest.
Once they placed Ted under arrest, they searched the vehicle again, and inside the vehicle they see 3 sets of IDs belonging to a woman from the Florida State University. It was the woman that he just attacked. They also found 21 stolen credit cards and stolen television set. While in prison because he was under arrest, February 1980, there was a woman named Carol Ann Boone. She was the mother of 2. Ted and Carol, they both had dated before his initial arrest, and in the courtroom during the penalty phase of his trial.
He proposed and she accepted in the presence of the judge, making the marriage legitimate in Florida. The 2 of them got married. The couple had met 6 years earlier when they both worked at the Department of Emergency Services, and then Carol gave birth to a daughter, and her name was Rose in 1982, and Ted was listed as the father of this baby. Carol eventually realized that Ted actually was guilty of all these crimes. Then she ended up divorcing him 3 years prior to his execution. According to her book is called A Stranger Beside Me. She stopped visiting Ted during the last 2 years of his imprisonment. And then in June 1979, Ted would stand trial for the homicides and assaults that had taken place at the sorority house, the ones that he did when he escaped prison. The trial was covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents and was the first to be televised nationally in the U.S. On February 10, 1980, Ted was sentenced to death by electrocution. As the sentence was announced, he reportedly stood up and shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." Now, he was sentenced to death, but it wouldn't be carried out until 9 years later. So for 9 years he sat in prison. Ted confessed to 2 detectives from Idaho, Utah, and Colorado that he had committed numerous additional homicides, including several that were unknown to the police. Ted would admit that there were other remains and other victims buried in Colorado, and he was telling this to the detectives and investigators while he was in prison. And when they would ask, "Oh, well, can you tell us where and who? Can you elaborate?" Ted refused to, so he just stuck to his short story. And in cases where he did give details, nothing was found. And it was believed that Ted would come forward with new information about other victims as a way to push back his executing date further and further. He was just buying himself time to not be electrocuted. And finally, Ted's punishment. Ted would eventually be put in an electric chair on January 24th, 1989. He was 42 years old. Now, many people celebrated when it was announced that Ted was dead. People sang, danced, and set off fireworks across the street from the prison as the execution was carried out. Then they cheered loudly as the hearse drove off from the prison to carry Ted to wherever he was going. People are cheering. His body was cremated in Gainesville, and his ashes were said to be carried at a undisclosed location in Washington State. Ted remained a suspect in several unsolved homicides, and is likely responsible for others that may never be identified. During a conversation in 1987, he confided in the county detective that there were more murders he would never ever talk about because they were too close to home, too close to family, or involved. Victims were very young. In 2011, Ted's DNA profile was added to the FBI's database for further references in hopes to close other unsolved murders. Ted's 1968 Volkswagen Beetle was displayed in the National Museum of Crime and Punishment in Washington, D.C. Now it's currently at the Alcatraz East Crime Museum in Tennessee. And that was Ted Bundy's case. Thank you to listening to episode 4 of PodCrime. See you guys next episode. Bye bye.